Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Seaquest. For those of you that don't know much about Seaquest, so this is our Bottlenose Dolphin evening webinar. So it is our 9th webinar, I think, so far, which is quite amazing. Seaquest Southwest is a citizen science project, and it's run by Cornwall Wildlife Trust's marine team. So we run land-based megafauna surveys, and we have a huge group of trained volunteers. Loads of you are watching tonight, so it's really nice to see your faces. And they conduct all the surveys for us, which is amazing. The project is coordinated by myself and Cheryl Yarman, and it's managed by Abby Crosby. Normally, we have a huge packed programme of events, so that includes talks, volunteer training, public watches, but unfortunately, we can't do many of those at the moment, and we haven't been able to do them for a few months. So instead, we've been hosting our webinars every week. And we've had some amazing talks so far. So if you have missed any of these, they are available on our YouTube channel. So that's on the Cornwall Wildlife Trust's marine YouTube channel. And you can keep an eye on our social media for when our next webinars are coming up. So I am really excited to introduce our speakers today. So first we have Dr. Simon Ingram, who is Associate Professor of Marine Conservation at the University of Plymouth. So since studying for his PhD on bottlenose dolphins in the Shannon Estuary in Ireland, Simon has been researching these fascinating animals around the world for over 20 years. So we can't wait to see a little bit more about Simon's research. So Simon, you can take it away when you're ready.
Okay, so as Claire said, so I'm a bottlenose dolphin biologist. I did my PhD, gosh, nearly 25 years ago. I started my PhD in Ireland. So I've been working on bottlenose dolphins for quite a long time. And I'm not going to go into the real nitty gritty of the science that I've been doing, but I'm going to sort of hopefully sort of touch on some of the aspects of what research has led us to discover about these fascinating animals. And then I'll leave the science to Becky, who's going to be talking about her work and the science that she's been doing around our coasts on these animals. So yeah, so I did my PhD in Ireland, following a designation of a protected area when they started to protect this species amongst other species and habitats under European legislation. And my PhD was really to go in and to try and find out about the population that was being protected by a newly designated marine protected area. So now, yeah, so now I'm an associate professor of marine conservation at the University of Plymouth, and I'm still working on bottlenose dolphins. And this is a slide, actually a slide I pinched from Becky's presentation. She said she wasn't going to use this slide. I thought it'd be quite useful just to start off talking about bottlenose dolphins for those of you who may not have seen them. Quite often people tell us, oh, we've seen dolphins, and you try and work out what species it was from the description they gave. They're very easy to tell apart from other species, mainly because they're very big and chunky, and they're fairly uniform grey. They're darker on the dorsal surface and paler on the sides and the belly, but they're pretty big. They're much slower moving than common dolphins. They tend to surface a little bit more gracefully. They don't seem to splash around quite so much, but quite often you'll see them leaping and jumping, and usually traveling in fairly small groups. So it's unusual to see bottlenose dolphins in groups of more than 20, 25 animals, whereas common dolphins you can see in 200-300 size schools. Okay, so they're sort of fairly easy to tell from other dolphins, and they're also very commonly seen around the coast. But in fact, they're found worldwide to sort of temperate latitudes. We're sort of approaching the limit of the northern distribution of the species in the northern hemisphere, but they're found across open ocean, all the way around the world, in tropical and temperate seas. So they're very, very widely distributed. And just to sort of give us a little bit of history about what we have discovered about this species, they first came to most people's attention, members of the public, because they were one of the species that were captured from the wild and then trained to perform in aquaria. And in this country, thankfully, these days are long behind us, but still there are lots of aquaria around the world that have bottlenose dolphin exhibits for entertainment. And one of the things that people realized when they first started to capture and train these animals is how amenable they were to training and how intelligent they were. So it's obvious from those first encounters with them that they were actually dealing with very intelligent animals. And the first scientific research actually started to look at these animals that were being held in captivity, because scientists thought, well, there are animals in captivity, I can collect some data. And this is one of the early researchers, John Lilly, who started recording the sounds that dolphins were making and using recordings from captive animals that he was able to access from aquaria. The problem with this sort of science is that you are basically observing animals in a very artificial environment. So you're not really learning very much about how they behave in nature. And if I just sort of update this, now people's interest, at least in many parts of the world, has turned from using animals for entertainment in aquaria to going to visit animals in their own habitat and observing them in the wild and taking much more, appreciating them much more for being able to see them in the wild. And this is something we can do around our coasts in the Southwest. So this is a very, very big industry, multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide. And alongside the growth in dolphin watching and whale watching, the science has turned from studying animals that are in captivity to going into nature, finding the animals in their own habitat and collecting data of animals doing the natural things that they have evolved to do in the wild. And a lot of these studies that scientists started round about the end of the 1970s started to yield really interesting data as those studies started to collect long-term data, often relating to individuals. So long-term studies, partly due to conservation monitoring. So like my study, trying to find out about animals and monitor them as part of a conservation management scheme, allowed scientists to start to collect long-term data and start to discover things about these populations that they were protecting. But at the core of it, a lot of cetacean science comes back to very simple observations, quite often based on individual recognition of animals. And Becky's going to be talking a lot more about photo ID, but this is just to introduce the concept. You can see in that photograph of the bottlenose dolphin in the bottom right of that picture, that's an animal that I've known in the Shannon Estuary. Unfortunately, he's now dead, but that's an animal that I knew from the first time I ever did any dolphin research in Ireland, and I could tell him immediately because he's got those big marks on the dorsal fin. And if you look at the picture in the top, we can do the same for lots of different species. So that's actually a diving sperm whale in the top picture, and we can use natural marks on the tails of whales, just like we do with dolphins, to tell individuals. And once we can tell an individual apart from other individuals, this gives the scientist a great insight into the lives of individuals. So photo ID uses various features on animals. In humpback whales, it uses the pigments on the underside of their tail. Bottlenose dolphins, it uses the nicks that we can see on the trailing edge. There's number one again, that animal from the previous slide. And with killer whales, we use a combination of pigment patterns and nicks on the dorsal fin. And this is a really cheap, it's an easy, non-invasive technique that has got a great potential to give us really powerful data. And those data, long-term survival, birth rates, we can even measure growth rates from the photographs by measuring the animals in the photographs and follow those animals throughout their life. And some long-term studies that have been looking at bottlenose dolphins now for 30 years and now have got 3 generations in their ID catalogues of animals of known parentage with known grandparents still living in the same population. So this gives great insight into the lives of these animals in their natural habitat. Okay, so yeah, so this is number one again. This is the first picture in 1996 that I took of that animal. And this is the last time I saw that animal, shortly before it disappeared, presumed dead in 2009. And you can see the marks have sort of changed a little bit as the animals sort of the dorsal fins got more worn, but you can immediately see that that is the same animal from those photographs. So photo ID gives us great ability to identify animals throughout long periods of time. And just to give you an impression of what that means in the lifetime of an animal, that's a picture of me when I first photographed that animal in 1996. And that's me in 2009. And you can see that I think I've probably changed a lot more than the dolphin from those photographs. So photo ID gives us a great power to follow these animals throughout their lives. Alongside photo ID, I've also been involved in genetics projects where we can take a small plug of skin, and once we've got really good photo ID data and we know who's who and we know what areas of the coast animals are using, by taking a small plug of skin, we can look at the relatedness using genetics between different animals from different sites. And this gives us even more information about the animals that we've been tracking using photo ID. It allows us to tell us whether animals are part of the same breeding population, and that's really important for conservation. Okay, so if we look at the waters sort of just west of the UK, this is the results of an aerial survey off the west shelf EEZ of Ireland. So these were surveys conducted in aeroplanes over a 2-year period. And what's amazing from this photograph is that you can see the distribution of bottlenose dolphins covers the entire EEZ of Ireland. So they're distributed widely throughout the Northern Atlantic. And this abundance estimate, based on these aerial surveys, showed that there are about 200,000 bottlenose dolphins living just in the EEZ of our neighbour Ireland. So these are a very abundant species. And the genetics work that I alluded to a minute ago has shown us that rather than those animals being part of one big population that covers the entire northeastern Atlantic, actually there appears to be at least 4 different subpopulations. And these, this is borne out through the genetic data that was analysed by a French scientist called Marie-Louise. And she used the skin from these animals to identify 4 populations: a pelagic population, which we can see down there in the bottom left. These are probably the ones that we've just seen in that slide from Ireland. And we've seen Mediterranean animals in the top right, the top left in A. And if we look at the right, we can see B and D being a south and a north coastal form of these animals. So immediately, this is very fuzzy, large scale, broad brush, but it tells us that there is reproductive isolation amongst different populations of this species in the region of the seas around Western Europe. So we can't just treat these animals as one single huge population. And if we zoom in a little bit around the UK, we can see that there are hotspots where animals are seen much more frequently than other places. And what's interesting here is that these are coastal animals using parts of our coast, typically large estuaries or embayments around our coast. And these are part of that coastal, what we call an ecotype. And a PhD student of mine who was working in Ireland was using data from old bottlenose dolphin specimens that were found in museums and bones that had been dredged up by fishermen in the North Sea, and analysing those data and comparing them to modern bottlenose dolphins that were sampled from around the coast today. And she found that all of the animals that live around these coastal waters, the coastal ecotype, they're all direct descendants from original founders that set up these populations, probably at the end of the last ice age. So you can imagine as the ice started to retreat at the end of the last ice age, it started to reveal new coastline. And that coastline offered habitat opportunities. And some of those pelagic animals moved into that coastline and set up home, living in those coastal areas. And the animals that we see around our coast today are direct descendants from those animals. And we know that from the mitochondrial DNA that we've been able to sample from ancient animals and from living animals. So these coastal animals are really special, okay? They're separate from these very large pelagic populations. We're talking about pockets of 100 or so animals in these different locations around the UK. At the same time, we do know that these animals are quite migratory and quite mobile. So animals have been tracked from photo ID studies moving around the entire west coast of the UK and Ireland. So we know they're mobile, but they're all part of this coastal population. And they've even been assigned status by ICES as monitoring units for monitoring ecosystems going forward. So we can use them as indicators of ecosystem health. And you can see on this map here that the south coast of England, the southwest coast of England, is listed as one of those populations that should be used as an indicator of good ecosystem condition. And this is part of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is another EU piece of legislation. Okay, so these coastal animals are living really close to the coast. And when I say coastal, and Becky will probably talk about this in a while, I mean very, very coastal. And you can see from this photograph just how close to the rocks these animals are. Well, these coastal ecotypes are very happy living very, very close to shore. And this brings them into direct contact with human activities. So they are living in a very highly impacted part of our marine environment. They're top predators, so they rely on having a healthy prey distribution to be able to support their foraging requirements. So they're sitting at the top of quite a large sort of food chain dependent on healthy ecosystems around the coast. They're also slow, they're long-lived and slow breeding. So they don't have many calves. They have one calf maximum once every 2 or 3 years for a female. So we're talking about quite slow reproductive growth. And these are what we call elements of what we call a case-selected species. And we've already learned that they're highly mobile. So they're very, very challenged in terms of their contact with human impact in the marine environment. And they're also very vulnerable because of the ecological status that they have. But interestingly, I've alluded to their intelligence earlier. They're very, very complex in their behavior. They're very highly social, and they adapt to their coastlines and develop quite novel foraging methods in different locations because they have got what we call behavioral plasticity. Okay, so living in this coastal zone, they get a double whammy because they're exposed to terrestrial impacts that are basically affecting the draining water that comes out of our river system. So things that could be a long way from the sea, farming, for example, and industry might release pollutants into the water system that then has a knock-on effect in coastal waters. But they're also directly impacted by coastal exploitation from things like fisheries that are taking prey out of the system that they might need to support them. So they're living in a very, very precarious habitat. They're highly intelligent. They have a high degree of phylopatry, which means that they tend to be quite local in terms of their distribution. So an animal that is born in one area tends to live in that area for the rest of its life. So there's a strong sort of local site faithful behavior. They often live in very small, highly connected, highly social populations. But those populations, as we have found from the genetics, tend to be quite reproductively isolated. So they may be part of this big single coastal ecotype, but those little pockets of animals that I showed you on the map earlier are actually probably quite reproductively isolated. And we can see that from the genetics quite easily. All of these things, the intelligence, living in isolated small communities, being highly social, communicating with each other, they all lend themselves to ecological and behavioral plasticity, which means that they can adapt to the conditions, to learn new ways to forage very, very readily. Now, I didn't look at the clock before I started talking, so I don't know if Claire can tell me or anybody can tell me how many minutes I've got left.
I didn't either, but it's fine. Just keep going.
Okay. So one of the parallels that scientists quite often draw between cetacean behavior and society is with the studies that zoologists have done on primates. And primate zoology goes back to the days of Jane Goodall, decades of research And with primates, we're able to get very, very good access to these animals and take very detailed notes and observations of their behavior. And as cetacean biology slowly starts to catch up, remember it's a fairly new science, we start to see lots of parallels between the behavior in complex cetacean societies that we've seen in primate societies. So one example that often people will cite is male alliances. And this is one of those features, not of animals in our coastal region, but in places like the eastern coast of the US, adolescent bottlenose dolphins form very strong bonds with other adolescent males, and they spend most of their adult life with those other males, and they form what are called male alliances. And those male alliances will exist for their entire life. They spend more than 80% of their time with these other males. This is not ever observed in Europe. We've never seen this in this side of the Atlantic, but it's something that we see quite often in this smaller coastal bottlenose dolphins that we get in coasts around places like Florida. Okay, we don't really know the function of this, but we think it's related to access to females, so it's probably got some reproductive strategy. They've also learned specialized feeding behaviors. So these animals that live in very local, they're very site faithful, remember, they're living in small communities and they communicate with each other. And they've learned how to fish for prey in particular ways that suit that habitat. And this photograph here is a bunch of dolphins that have stranded themselves on a mud bank, and they've done that deliberately because what they're doing is they're swimming together and creating a little wave in front of them, a pressure wave that's pushing the mullet that they're trying to fish up out of the water onto a mud bank. And they followed the fish out of the water, and as they're lying there on their sides, they're getting the fish in their mouths and eating them. And this is something that has only been observed in a few sites on the east coast of the US. And these are what they call in the US those bayous, those shallow, muddy tributaries around the coast. And this foraging behavior has been learned and become a tradition amongst dolphins that live in these societies in just this particular habitat. And this is passed down through generations of animals that learn from their mothers how to fish in this particular way. So this is a local tradition that is peculiar to these dolphins that are living in this particular habitat. Another example of unique behavior is what we call sponging. And this is where animals that live in Shark Bay on the other side of the world are feeding in the sands at the bottom of shallow seas. And to protect their rostrums or their beaks from sea urchin spines, they learnt that if they pick up a sponge and carry it on the end of their rostrum, it acts as like a glove over the end of their beak, and it stops them getting spiked when they're digging around in the sand. And this is a behavior that has been picked up by a bunch of animals that are foraging and living in the same community and have learnt this behavior. So this is a peculiar behavior that has been learnt and passed on through animals belonging to this population. Again, this is something that is passed down through the female line, and this is because it's the mothers who are bringing up the young ones and teaching them how to forage, and they spend a lot of time with their mothers as they're growing up, and the mothers are teaching them these different techniques. Again, in Western Australia and Shark Bay, these are animals that have learned how to shoal fish into very shallow waters near the beach. And when the fish are stuck really close to shore, the dolphins accelerate and start to hydrofoil on their flippers and lift themselves out of the water so they can skim across the water into water that is only a couple of inches deep, where they pick up the fish and then turn around quickly and get back out into deeper water. A really unusual behavior, adapting to a very specialist coastal habitat that is passed on through this matrilineal tradition. Okay, the last example I'm going to give you is in Brazil. And this is a place where fishermen are entirely reliant on bottlenose dolphins to help them catch fish. And this is a fishery that is operating in a series of lagoons in southern Brazil. These people are pretty poor. They're living in this village entirely reliant on fishing, and the fishing is entirely reliant on dolphins. And what the fishermen do is they stand in the water up to their thighs, waiting for dolphins to come along, and the dolphins shoal the fish towards the line of fishermen, and then they indicate to the fishermen when to throw their nets by surfacing with an idiosyncratic surfacing behavior that the fishermen recognize. This is really unusual because this is dolphins that have trained fishermen how to catch fish, and the fishermen are entirely reliant. And if the dolphins aren't there, the fishermen don't even attempt to catch their fish. They basically go there and wait for the dolphins to see them. And when the dolphins have seen them, they start to shoal the fish towards them. And this helps the fishermen catch the mullet that they depend on. Okay, so I've worked in this site in southern Brazil. It's really quite amazing. You might have seen this on television. It's been covered a couple of times. And I'm just going to finish off by bringing this back to home. So we've been talking about this coastal ecotype. The coastal ecotype lives around the coast here, and Becky's going to talk much more about her research on these animals. But Nick Tregenza told me about a behaviour that used to be observed in Plymouth that is no longer seen, where dolphins were congregating around the mouth of Who Lake near Mountbatten. And you can see in this picture, this is a muddy, shallow lake that flooded with the tide, and then the mud banks were exposed as the water dropped. And as the tide went out, dolphins would wait at the exit of Who Lake for mullet to be escaping from the lake to avoid being stranded. And they would feed on those mullet, and they would know exactly when to travel to the mouth of the lake to catch the tide at the right stage so they could forage. We don't see that anymore because those animals have been lost and they've taken their traditions with them. And if we want to preserve these weird and wonderful behaviors that we've observed around the world, we need to make sure that these populations are properly conserved and managed. Okay, that's all I want to say. I'm sorry if I went over time, but I'll hand back over to Claire. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was great to hear about all the different bottlenose dolphin populations around the world, and yeah, hear a lot more about the species. So next up we've got Rebecca Dudley. So Rebecca is the Marine Biodiversity Officer for Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust currently. But before she relocated to Scotland, she completed a Master's of Research in Applied Marine Science at the University of Plymouth. So this is where she got involved with the Bottlenose Dolphin Consortium. During her master's thesis, Rebecca identified England's first resident population of bottlenose dolphins. So here she is to tell a bit more about this fascinating research. So take it away, Rebecca, when you're ready.
Is that working okay?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant. Okay. All right, hi everyone. So like Claire said, I did my master's thesis on the bottlenose dolphin population around the southwest. So I'm just going to present the findings that I have, and also before we move forward onto where Claire will give us an update on where the project is. So first of all, it was a huge project with a lot of people sharing their data. So thank you to all of the data contributors. It was a huge effort from everyone to submit sightings and photos over a long period of time. So before we started the project, what did we already know about the population? So we did, from a previous study, know that, or thought that from the 1970s till 1991, that bottlenose dolphins were actually absent from the area. And then the last extensive study that occurred in the southwest was undertaken by Wood in 1998, who confirmed that the bottlenose dolphins had returned, and that there was a minimum of 51 in that population. So sightings have continued since then. And they were the most commonly cited species in a study in 2012, but also this studies showed that there was a decline in the amount of sightings as well. So we know that from previous studies there's might only be 50 individuals, but also that the population numbers might be declining as well. Yeah, we need to find out more basically. So what I wanted to do was gain a better understanding of the population, and this was by using opportunistic sightings provided by members of the public. So both the sighting information, but also, very importantly, the photographs that people had taken over the years as well. So what we wanted to do after we'd created this big database is discriminate between the coastal resident population, also the non-resident animals. So those are the ones visiting from offshore. We then wanted to analyse the levels of residency, so how often these animals are seen along the coastline, their spatial distribution, where they're seen most, and also try and find out an updated number of the population levels as well. And ultimately, all that information will go into hopefully getting effective conservation measures for this small population. So the Southwest Bottlenose Dolphin Consortium was set up, and it was a collaborative partnership with various stakeholders within the region, led by the Cornwall Wildlife Trust. So key individuals were identified, and all this information was incorporated into this huge shared database. So this, the sightings came from all sorts of sources. So they came from the sightings database that Claire mentioned earlier with the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, but also just members of the public, from ferry journeys, so when people are taking photos and sightings on ferries, marine tour operators as well, land-based observations, and also some charitable organisations as well. And the red stars there are just showing where a lot of the data came from. So sort of marine discovery there in Penzance, a marine tour operator did contribute quite a lot to the data to the study. So Simon sort of talked a little bit about photo identification already, but I'll sort of go into a little bit more detail and then point out some of the most identifiable species that we have in the Southwest population. Some of you might have seen these individuals before. So like Simon said, luckily for us researchers, bottlenose dolphins can be identified by photos of their dorsal fins. That's a fin on their backs. So each one of those is unique to each individual dolphin. So it's almost like having a dolphin fingerprint, essentially. So you can use nicks and scars from the trailing edge, so the back of the dorsal fin, the leading edge, and also nicks and scars as well. But the trailing edge is particularly important because this is the area that is the most distinguishable, and it's also susceptible to tearing. So once a nick develops over time, that nick tends to get larger and larger. So here are some examples of some of the dolphins. I don't know if any of you guys recognize this, but number 1 in the catalogue was topless here. Then number 2 is an individual known as Scratchy. And then number 11 was a personal favourite of mine when I was doing the study because he was so recognisable. So even if I had photographs of a really sort of misty day, I always knew when overhang was there. So once I incorporated all of the photographs that I had from all the encounters, what I did then was look at the mark severity of those animals. So from those 3 individuals, topless, Scratchy, and overhang, you can all see that they go into the group 1 there. So they are permanently marked, so what I called severity 1. So these individuals are really important because they can be recognised year after year. So throughout the decade that I focused on, up to 2016, these guys popped up time and time again. So severity number 2, superficially marked animals. So these guys are much more difficult to identify unless you have really clear pictures, really well lit pictures as well. But you can see that the scar circled there is one that's probably going to last multiple years, so can still be used in some of the data analysis. And then you've got the temporarily marked animals. So you can see some slight scarring there on the leading edge of that dorsal fin, but that scar is probably going to disappear in the next annual year. So it's not so good at looking at and including him in the analysis because he might not be identifiable next year. So what was really important to do, because the data came from so many different people with so many different camera systems, some from land, some from the sea, we needed to grade the photos that were given. So what I did was give them a mark from 1 to 4. So firstly, looked at the image and thought, is the fin size over 10% of the image? So you can see that individual there in photograph number 4. If you really zoomed in, you might be able to get an ID on him, but it's not going to have a very well lit or accurate picture of that dorsal fin. So stage number 2, is that animal in focus? And if that's a no, then it's grade 3 or 2. Is it the correct part of the dorsal fin? So sometimes you'll get a picture of a dolphin that just sort of skims the surface, and if it's got a really identifiable marks on that top half, you might be able to identify that dolphin, but you also might be missing some of the features that's under the water as well. And then lighting is one of the most important photo graded standards that you can look at, because like you see with those superficially marked animals and the temporally marked animals, you need really good lighting to see the scars on that dorsal fin. So basically what this did was make sure that all the data that was incorporated into the analysis was as accurate as possible, and that we weren't over representing the population by adding in individuals. So here are just some examples, and you can see grade 1 there is sort of the top-notch photo ID kind of photo that you want. So all these photos were incorporated into an ID catalogue, which was firstly sort of given to us by Marine Discovery, and then I added individuals to that. And what I also did as well was include which years these dolphins have been seen. So again, this is number 2, Scratchy, and you can see he's been seen in multiple years, so right from 2008 there through to 2016, so quite an important individual. And now just looking a little bit about what Simon talked about earlier with one of his favourite dolphins from when he did his PhD. So White Strike was also another favourite dolphin, and I think he's a really good example of how dorsal fins can change over the years. So you can see here, when he was first seen in 2010, he had these 2 small notches at the top of his dorsal fin. In 2011, another notch joined the picture there, so you can see a much larger notch just underneath. And moving along to 2012, this dolphin has obviously been through the wars throughout the years, because he's acquired some more notches underneath as well. So you can see a real change just through 2 years of data. And then you can see 2012, 2013, and then 2015, he's acquired even more sort of scarring on the leading edge of his dorsal fin as well. And what also this shows you is how important historical records can be. So you may have photos from 10 years ago and think, oh, no one needs to know about these, they're not useful to researchers anymore. Well, actually, they really can be, because you might have a picture of a dolphin that shows that progression throughout the years. So it really helps us when we look at a photo of the photos. And this just shows that real difference, just from 4 years, how different that dorsal fin now looks. Okay, so that was the sort of how I graded the data and got that into the shared database. So like I said, it's real massive effort. So over 3,800 records of bottlenose dolphins were entered into that database. And we had over 190 photographed encounters over this 10-year period that I worked on. And you can see that the sightings came from throughout the southwest coastline. So 98 individuals, so excluding calves, were entered into the catalogue that I made, and there were 765 re-sightings. So when you look at this graph here, so it's the number of individuals along the y-axis and the number of sightings along the x-axis. And you can see there that some individuals had between 61 and 70 re-sightings. So that means that they were photographed on numerous encounters. But what that does is not show us the whole picture of this population, because what we want to know about is the coastal population. We want to get an accurate number of those guys and exclude the visiting dolphins, so they're the ones that come from deeper waters. So it's not just enough to look at where the sightings came from. We want to look at their social structure. So which animals were spending time with which ones. So the dolphins were divided into communities using a program called SOCFROG, which looked at which dolphins were spending time with which other dolphins within the group. And you can see that 10 clusters were identified using SOCFROG. So you can see a large population A there. So the squares that are coloured in blue were identified more than once, and the squares coloured in grey were only seen once. So you can see that community A are the dolphins that have been seen over and over and over again, and they weren't seen with any of the dolphins that were in community B, right through to I and J there as well. So we think that network A, they must be the coastal resident population. They must be the ones that we're seeing all the time. And I and J there were lone individuals. So some bottlenose dolphins do sort of get outcasted from the population. I don't know if any of you heard of, well, he's called Colette up in Scotland, but when I was doing the work down in Cornwall and in France, he was called Georges, but he was this dolphin that travelled all the way up the UK just spending time in harbours and bays. So that's individual J there. You can see he's been seen more than once, but that's probably because he spends a lot of time around humans and around boats. So then we looked at where the sightings were in accordance to depth, and Simon sort of alluded to this already, that coastal dolphins really are coastal. They tend to stick really close to shore. So when we're looking at all of these records, we want to know which ones are coastal. Well, you look at where the sightings are in accordance to that depth. So you can see here all the individuals in network A were seen at a mean depth of 15 metres, which is pretty shallow really, and were never seen below 15 metres in depth. Whereas all the other networks, the mean was over 50 metres, and you can just see there's just a couple of sightings here that were less than 10 metres, but again that was only with network I and J, those lone individual dolphins. So it was none of the other big groups, which we think were pelagic groups, were seen below 10 metres. So this is just another way to prove and to show that network A are our coastal dolphins, but because before we want to do any other further analysis on them, look at their spatial distribution and look at the abundance numbers of those dolphins, we want to eliminate all of the offshore bottlenose dolphins, so we don't overinflate the population number. We're not including any individuals that aren't part of that coastal population. So once we've done all that, we've deciphered that network A is our coastal population. We can re-look at all of those sightings records and pull out all of the information that's purely of those coastal dolphins. So all of the dots now that are in red are those pelagic animals or the lone dolphins. So automatically you can see from just pulling those pelagic dolphins out how coastal these dolphins now are, and they're not seen in more than 50 metres. And again, you're looking at the same graph that I showed you earlier on the numbers of sightings of these dolphins. And you can see again now pulling out the red data there is all the pelagic animals. You can see that most of the coastal animals are seen more than 11 times, and they're the only ones that are seen between 60 and 70. So those are those re-sightings rates. Now looking at the degree of residency, so are these animals sort of permanent to the area? You can look at what's known as the discovery curve. So this is displaying the sighting rate of all of the new permanently marked individuals that are in that catalogue. And when that discovery curve is increasing, what it shows you is that there's animals continually added to the catalogue. So you would think that more data needs to be acquired because even more animals are continually to be discovered. But when again you pull out just the individuals from network A, you can see a completely different picture. The line is completely plateaued, which means that all of the individuals in the catalogue have, we think, been captured. So we've captured all of the coastal dolphins and we can now analyse them further. Okay, so when looking at sort of conservation measures for the population, you want to know if the animals are resident all year round, if they're just popping up in the summer, or they're just popping up in the winter. So this graph here is showing the ID numbers down the side here. So ID number 15 would correspond to the white strike, the dolphin I showed you earlier, and then the shading of grey. The darker grey, the more sightings the animal has within a particular month. So you can see clearly there that majority of the residents are seen throughout the year, but there is a definite bias. Most of them are seen in the summer, and then you've got some data gaps in December and January. Now, that's probably due to effort bias. Most people, you guys will know this, especially if you're standing on land, there'll be a few hardcore members of you that will go out every single month with binoculars looking out for bottlenose, but there'll also be some people that just go on the nice sunny days, and I don't blame you for that at all. But also a lot of the data came from marine tour operators, which operate predominantly in the summer months as well. But over 85% of the individuals in the coastal population were seen over 8 months of the year, despite that effort bias. So really is alluding that these guys are seen all year round. So just quickly looking at the distribution. So you can see here it's not evenly distributed, but again, this is probably due to effort bias and where most of that data is come from. But it just shows you that there's real hotspots, possibly around Mount Spey and Penzance, and also in St Ives as well. But this doesn't really show the real picture, and I think there'll be more data that comes very soon that shows that they are even more wide-ranging than just the southwest region. So I showed this a little bit. So this graph looks quite busy, but what it basically shows is that these animals range really wide distances along the coastline. So the x-axis there, you can see the place names. So that's the amount of kilometres along the coastline from Heartland Point all the way up and around the coastline. So the box plot there is showing where the majority of those sightings are, but then you can see that with the dots and the stars there, they're outliers. So that's where some dolphins have been seen sort of over, yeah, the mean line, sorry, along the coastline there was 434 kilometres. So the majority of the dolphins range over 400 kilometres. It's just basically showing more and more that these dolphins really are wide-ranging, going all along the coastline. So again, looking at the seasonal distribution, so we know that they're seen all year round, but does their movements move according to the seasons? Because that would help with conservation measures. But I found actually that there wasn't much difference. So in winter, there's less records, but you can still see they do travel quite long distances. So in spring, when we're getting even more data, even further distances, but they're scattered, and this is throughout the 10 years of data that I collected. In summer, again, majority of the data collected, but really wide-ranging along the coastline, and autumn as well. And annual distribution, so this is the distribution solely on single years. So in 2007, we had much less data, but again, you can see they're probably pretty wide-ranging. And then throughout the years, the distribution does change. Sometimes they seem to constrict into one area, but then they'll bounce back again and start those long-ranging movements. Okay, so we know that they're really wide-ranging. We know there might be potential hotspots, but really, really importantly, how many are there in this population? So this is showing the abundance estimate throughout 5 years, so the last 5 years of the study, because that's when we had the best and the most data. And the y-axis is just showing numbers up there as well. So you can see it's pretty steady along the years, and the best estimate we got was 28 individuals. And then the grey dotted lines here are just showing the confidence intervals. So you can see in 2015, the data quality wasn't quite as good. so you've got higher confidence intervals there. But for most of the years, that's pretty steady. So we think that estimate is pretty accurate, and it provides a really great baseline from which future trends can be assessed. But what it also shows as well is that this population is quite a low number compared to other coastal populations throughout the UK, which are usually over 100 individuals. So this is, deemed pretty precariously low. So we need to know more about these and keep looking into this population. So just finishing on sort of the main findings here. So bottlenose dolphins in the southwest, we can segregate them, the coastal resident population, from other pelagic animals, which is really important when we're analysing the abundance and distribution. The dolphins are seen all along the southwest coastline and maybe even beyond. They are resident, they're seen throughout the year and over multiple years. And the population contains just 28 individuals. So yeah, we need to know more. That's not very many at all. So we need to work hard to try and get some conservation measures for these animals. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was great. It's so nice to see how the bottlenose dolphins sort of spread around the southwest, and great to see how many people have contributed to that research as well. So now I'm going to be telling a little bit about the future of the project. So this work is now being carried out by Shauna Kaur, who is a master's student at the University of Plymouth. And there are a few vital pieces of information that we need to know in order to protect these dolphins. So with increased offshore traffic, increased industry and noise, and all the stuff that Simon was talking about with the threats to these dolphins, it's really important that we find protection for these dolphins. And they're the southwest population in particular are very vulnerable to being threatened. So if we can find out where exactly they spend a lot of their time, what their movement patterns are, and how long they live for, we can inform legislation and policies to put those protections into place, so we can have specific protected areas just for those animals. So it can be quite similar to the resident populations in Scotland and in Wales that have a lot more protection than the English resident population of bottlenose dolphins. And because we have been in lockdown for the past few months, boat trips and land watches have been reduced, and most of them haven't been going out. So it's been really difficult for Shauna to collect the vital data that she needs to be able to find this information. But that means that basically she just really needs your help. So how can we help? So if you have any photos or videos of any southwest bottlenose dolphins, even if they're old or new, please share them. So you can submit them to the project. So you can do that if you see on this website here. So basically through AirKiss, there's a whole page dedicated to the Southwest Bottlenose Dolphin Project. So it looks like just this image here. So you can upload images and sort of basically details on that. And yeah, that really helps Shauna. Or you can just email Shauna if you've got any videos as well, is also useful, because you can still get photo identification stills from videos. So yeah, if you have any photos, please share them. Also spread the word. If you've got friends or people that are at sea all the time, tell them that if they do have any photos or videos of bottlenose dolphins, that it makes a huge difference if you can share those with the project. If you are interested in the project and you want to learn a little bit more, you can follow the consortium on Facebook. So that's the Southwest Bottlenose Dolphin Consortium. You can also get tickets for Shauna's talk. So Shauna is doing a talk for another Cornwall Wildlife Trust project, which is the Your Shore Beach Rangers project, and that's on the 1st of July. So you can get those tickets through Eventbrite. The tickets are free, just like this one, so it's very similar to this one. But yeah, it's basically Shauna talking about the whole future of her project. Or you can also watch Shauna's talk that she did for Seaquest in April on our Wildlife Trust Marine YouTube channel. So if you just search for the Cornwall Wildlife Trust Marine on YouTube, it has a link to and her talks on there too. So that'll give you information basically all about her whole project and how you can get involved. So I just want to say a huge thank you to both of our speakers, and it was great to hear all about bottlenose dolphins, and then get it really focused down into the Southwest, into Cornwall, and know how, you know, all the research that we do for Seaquest really helps projects like this. We're now going to do a question and answer session. So we've already had quite a few questions come through. Thank you. So if you do have any more questions, if you just pop them into the chat that's on the bottom of your screen, and then I can ask them to Becky or Simon or both. And also just want to say a massive thank you to Shauna for continuing on this research. And yeah, we can't wait to see the results of it all. So first question was from Kerry Pierce, and it is, what is the gestation period for a bottlenose dolphin? So that can be for either of you, whoever wants to answer it.
Okay, it's about a year. So this means that their seasonal behavior coincides with breeding and calving, so they can mate and calve during the same breeding season. So basically it means that annual migrations, they're seasonally synchronized.
Thank you. And just find some of the other ones. So I think this one was mostly focused towards Becky. What causes the notches and scarring on dorsal fins? Is this predation attacks or water traffic?
So it can be lots of different things actually. So some of it can just be genetic, so they're sort of born slightly weaker parts of the fin, but a lot of it is because of sort of interactions actually with each other. So the scarring on the sides is often rake marks, so that's marks made by the bottlenose dolphin teeth, and this can be just playful behaviour. It can be a bit more aggressive as well. Actually, a lot of the times the more well-marked individuals that we see tend to be male, so a lot of it comes from sort of that boisterous behaviour as well. But they could just acquire sort of a tiny little notch on the back of the dorsal fin from a nick from a rake mark, and then with the water movements over the years, that's what makes them sort of get larger and larger.
Thank you. So another one from Stu Collier. Over the last 10 years, I've noticed a massive decrease in bottlenose in my local area, which is Berry Head. But it seems common dolphins visit the area more. Would a decrease in one species lead to an increase in the other? And that can be to whoever wants to answer it.
Do you want me to take that? Short answer, no. There wouldn't be any displacement. We know that there are interactions between bottlenose dolphins and harbour porpoises, and in places where you get both species, harbour porpoises try and avoid bottlenose dolphins, because bottlenose dolphins are one of the biggest causes of death in harbour porpoises, but and occasionally common dolphins. But I've not seen any evidence that common dolphins avoid bottlenose dolphins, and it's actually very difficult to collect sufficient data to be able to say with any confidence whether the movements of different species are related. Okay, so even if they were, it would probably be very difficult for us to be able to say that with any confidence. I know that sounds like a get out, but quite often we just don't know. But it's in my opinion, it's quite unlikely.
Okay, thank you. Just a comment from Caroline. She just said, thank you, they were great presentations. Sky Neal said, is there a way to successfully identify individuals who do not have any obvious nicks or scars? I guess that
it's very, very difficult, I'd say. Sometimes I guess a unique sort of fin shape, but not necessarily, although photos of unmarked individuals are also really important as well. When you're looking at abundance estimates, it's quite important to know how many marked and unmarked individuals are within that group. So quite often we'll get sightings submitted of just really unique looking individuals, because let's face it, they're the most exciting ones to look at, and they're the ones that people want to know, you know, who is this individual, does it have a name? But actually unmarked individuals are just as important to the eventual analysis as well.
Thank you. So this is from Carrie Gilbert. What exactly are the protection measures that could potentially be put in place? I guess either of you, whoever wants to answer it.
Maybe Becky can chip in, but this is a very good question actually, and it's one of the things that at the end of Becky's project, when we had meetings to discuss her findings, it's okay, so what do we do now in terms of protection? One of the key, so I've spent a lot of time working in Ireland and Scotland, and the places I've worked, and I mentioned that my PhD followed on a designation. That designation was a special area of conservation, which is designated under the EU Habitats Directive. And that's been one of the key drivers of protected area designation for lots of species and habitats, including bottlenose dolphins and harbour porpoises, and both our seal species. But with Brexit, the Habitats Directive will no longer apply, at least in its current form. So if there had been no Brexit, we would probably be saying there needs to be an SAC. It's the most obvious designation. But that's not going to happen because of Brexit. So the next obvious designation would probably be a marine conservation zone for mobile species. And we've talked about maybe incorporating multiple cetacean species into a quite a large coastal marine conservation zone. And the marine conservation zones are designated under UK law. So that's actually an act of parliament for England and Wales. So that's not affected by Brexit. So that's probably, in terms of protected area designation, the most obvious options. But maybe there's another way of protecting these animals that isn't about designating a static protected area. Maybe there's a dynamic management approach where we look at the threats and we try and study in detail. And that's why we want to know the distribution of these animals in more detail. And that's one of the things Sean was looking at, is because we want to know where are those animals interacting at pinch points where there is a particular threat, so that we can then maybe try and highlight management around those threats in those particular areas or that time of year or whatever. And management in those terms would be different legislation, probably the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Anyway, so that's, I don't know if anybody wants to say any more than that, but
yeah, that's great, thank you. So that is all the rest of our questions, unless anyone quickly puts one in now. But thank you so much to Simon and Rebecca. It was great to have sort of a whole evening dedicated to our lovely bottlenose dolphins, and yeah, your presentations were fantastic, and I think everyone's really enjoyed it. So yeah, thank you both for speaking, and thank you everyone for watching. And yeah,